I don't want everybody to go home because I think what's so special about it is that, like, there's still to this day.
There are moments in a person's life that divide everything into a before and an after. Not the dramatic ones that announce themselves with noise and warning, but the quiet ones. The ones that happen in stillness, in private, in the unremarkable ordinariness of an afternoon that had no particular reason to become the afternoon that changed everything. Riley Keough knows what one of those moments feels like, because she was alone, or nearly alone, moving through the physical remnants of a life that was not hers, but that belonged to her in every way that mattered, and she found something that stopped her completely. Something small, something handwritten, something that had been waiting in the specific, patient way that only objects can wait, without urgency, without agenda, simply existing until the right person arrived to receive what was inside it. To understand why that moment hit the way it did, you have to understand what Riley Keough was carrying before she ever opened that letter. And the weight of it is not something that can be summarized quickly without doing it a disservice. In 2020, she lost her brother Benjamin, a loss so sudden and so complete that the people who knew him described the aftermath in terms that had nothing to do with the ordinary language of grief. Benjamin Keough was 27 years old. He was, by every account from people who loved him, a deeply sensitive and deeply private person who had spent his short life navigating the impossible gravitational pull of a name that the world treated as mythology and that he experienced as simply the family he was born into. His death broke something in the people who loved him that has never fully repaired. And Riley, who was close to him in the way that siblings are close when they are both trying to make sense of an inherited world that neither of them designed, carried that loss forward into every day that followed. And then, in January of 2023, her mother, Lisa Marie Presley, the only child of Elvis Presley, a woman who had spent her entire life in the eye of a storm she did not choose and who had fought with a fierceness that people who knew her described as the most essentially Lisa Marie thing about her, to be seen as something other than a footnote to her father's legend. Gone. At 54 years old, suddenly, leaving behind 4 children, an estate, a legacy, and a grief so acute that the people who loved her are still, at this moment, learning to breathe inside it. Riley Keough became, in the aftermath of her mother's death, the person through whom everything flows forward. The executor of the estate, the custodian of Graceland, the last living direct descendant of Elvis Presley in her generation, holding in her hands a responsibility that she did not ask for and that she has shouldered with a quiet, determined grace that everyone who has watched her do it has found remarkable. She was not given time to simply grieve. She was given a task, an enormous, complex, historically weighted task, and she stepped into it while still learning to exist in a world that no longer contained her mother. It was inside this task, inside the process of going through what her family had left behind, of making decisions about what to preserve and what to release and what to hold close, that she found it. A letter, handwritten, in the specific, slightly hurried script of a man who had a great deal to say and was not always given to taking his time saying it. Addressed to Priscilla. Dated in a period that placed it inside one of the most complicated chapters of their relationship. Sealed, or once sealed, in the way that letters are sealed when the person writing them understands that what is inside belongs only to the person it is addressed to and to no one else in the world. There is a particular sensation that comes from holding a handwritten letter from a dead person. It is unlike almost any other encounter with the past that exists, more intimate than a photograph, more immediate than a recording, more personal than any biography or documentary or official account. A handwritten letter carries the physical trace of the person who wrote it in a way that nothing else does. the pressure of the pen, the places where the writing slows down or speeds up, the words that were crossed out and replaced with different ones, the margins where a thought that didn't fit in the main body of the letter was squeezed in sideways because it was too important to leave out. All of it is information. All of it is presence. All of it is the person, reaching across whatever distance of time separates them from the reader and making contact. Riley Keough held her grandfather's handwriting in her hands. A grandfather she never knew. Elvis died 4 years before she was born, but whose presence has shaped every single day of her life in ways both visible and invisible. A man who was everything to everyone, and who, in this letter, was something smaller and realer and infinitely more human than the mythology has ever managed to capture. She read what he wrote to the woman he loved, and what she found inside those pages was not the Elvis the world thinks it knows. It was someone else entirely. Someone who had been waiting, in a drawer, for the right person to finally be ready to meet him. The question is what he said. And the answer is something that changes the entire story. Before that letter can mean what it means, you have to understand the relationship it came from. Not the version that has been constructed and maintained and polished across decades of documentaries and authorized biographies and carefully managed public appearances by the people involved. The real one. The one that existed in the private spaces between all of that, in the quiet of Graceland, when the crowds were gone and the cameras were off, and two people who loved each other were left alone with the extraordinary difficulty of what their life together actually required of them. Because Elvis and Priscilla Presley were not a fairy tale. They were something far more interesting and far more human than that. And understanding what they actually were to each other is the only way to understand why a letter written by one of them to the other carries the weight that it does. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed. And that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. It began in Germany, 1959. Elvis was 24 years old and serving his military tour, already the most famous person in the world by a considerable distance, already living inside the particular loneliness that kind of fame produces, surrounded constantly by people and genuinely known by almost none of them. Priscilla Presley was 14, the daughter of an Air Force officer. She was brought to meet Elvis at a party, and what happened in that meeting was something that both of them described across many years of describing it in terms that suggested it was not ordinary, that there was a recognition, a specific quality of connection that neither of them had words for at the time, but that both of them felt with a certainty that shaped every decision that followed. What also followed was something that the romantic mythology of their relationship has consistently underplayed. Priscilla was a teenager, and Elvis was a global icon operating inside a management structure that had very specific ideas about his public image and the kinds of relationships that were appropriate to it. The dynamic between them was not simple. It was not equal. There was an enormous imbalance of power and experience and worldly knowledge that shaped everything: how they communicated, what was expected of her, what she was permitted to ask of him, and what she was not. Priscilla has spoken about this with remarkable honesty in the years since, with the clarity of a woman who has had decades to understand what she was navigating at 14 and 15 and 16, and who refuses to flatten the complexity of it into something more comfortable than it actually was. She came to Graceland. She finished school there. She waited, for years she waited, in a house that was extraordinary by any measure, and that was simultaneously, for a young woman far from her family, and tethered to a man whose presence was as unpredictable as his career demanded, profoundly isolating. Elvis would leave for months at a time. Films, performances, the relentless machinery of a career that stopped for nothing and no one, including the people who needed him to stop. And Priscilla would remain at Graceland, learning what it meant to love someone who belonged to the world in a way that left only fragments of himself available for the people closest to him. They married in 1967, and the marriage, which the world received as the completion of a love story, was from the inside something more complicated from the very beginning. The pressure was immediate and total. Lisa Marie arrived in 1968, and the joy of that, and it was real joy, genuine and complete, existed alongside the grinding reality of a life that the machine continued to demand regardless of what was happening at home. Elvis was away. Elvis was always, in some essential way, away. Physically present sometimes, but divided in a way that the people who loved him most felt constantly and could never quite address directly without running into the specific, immovable fact of who he was and what his existence required of everyone around him. The divorce came in 1973, and here is the part that the simple narrative of heartbreak and betrayal has never done justice to, the part that the letter, when Riley read it, apparently illuminated with a clarity that decades of public storytelling had failed to provide. They did not stop loving each other. The divorce was not the ending of something, but the changing of its form, a recognition, arrived at painfully and honestly by both of them, that the shape their love had been forced into was not sustainable, and that the people inside it deserved something different. Priscilla has said across many interviews and many years that Elvis was the love of her life. She has said it without qualification and without the kind of careful distancing that people use when they are trying to manage a complicated legacy. She has said it the way people say things that are simply true. And Elvis, who was not always able to say the things that were simply true, whose public life demanded a version of himself that had very little room in it for unguarded honesty, apparently found, in the privacy of a handwritten letter, a way to say them anyway, to say what the performance of his life had made it almost impossible to say in person, to reach across the distance that fame and machines and pharmaceutical management and the sheer relentless weight of being Elvis Presley had placed between him and the woman who had known him longest and loved him most honestly. That is what Riley Keough found in that letter. Not a celebrity's love note, not a historical artifact to be cataloged and archived, a man trying, in the private language of pen and paper, to finally close the distance, and what he wrote in that attempt is what we need to talk about next. There is a version of Elvis Presley that the world has always had access to. The voice, the performances, the press conferences where he was charming and deflective and impeccably controlled in the way that people are controlled when they have been trained by experience and by the machine around them to understand that certain things are not safe to say in public. That version of Elvis is real. It is not a fabrication, but it is incomplete in a way that the people who loved him privately have always known, and that the public record has never fully been able to correct. Because the part of Elvis that was most essentially him, the part that felt things with an intensity that his public persona was specifically designed to contain, lived almost entirely in private. And private, for a man whose life was as comprehensively managed as his was, meant almost nowhere, except apparently in this letter. What Riley Keough found in those pages was not what she expected, and what she expected given everything she knew about her grandfather and everything she had grown up understanding about the mythology surrounding him was already considerable. but a letter written by the private Elvis, the one who existed in the spaces the machine could not reach, operates by entirely different rules than the public one. It does not perform. It does not manage. It does not calculate the distance between what is true and what is safe to say, and then carefully position itself somewhere in between. It simply speaks. And what it says, in the specific, unguarded language of a man who has picked up a pen and decided, for once, to stop managing the distance between himself and the person he is writing to, is something that lands with a weight that none of the official record has ever matched. The letter begins with love, but not the love of a myth, not the grand, sweeping, cinematic love that the public version of Elvis and Priscilla has always been sold as. The love in this letter is smaller and realer and infinitely more moving for being both of those things. It is the love of a man who knows he has been absent in ways that matter and who is no longer willing to pretend, even to himself, that the reasons for that absence fully excuse it. He writes about Priscilla with a specificity that is striking, not in generalities, not in the romantic vocabulary of someone performing affection, but in the particular details that only belong to someone who has paid genuine attention. The way she moved through a room, the quality of her patience, which he describes with an admiration that has the unmistakable texture of guilt underneath it, the specific, irreplaceable way she made Graceland feel like something other than a performance venue. And then, the letter shifts, and this is where it becomes something more than a love letter. This is where it becomes a confession. He writes about regret with a directness that the public Elvis was constitutionally incapable of. Not vague, performative regret, the kind that sounds like an apology but asks nothing of the person making it. Specific regret, named and dated and undefended. He writes about the absences, not just the physical ones, the months away on films and tours and the endless obligations of the machine, but the interior absences, the times he was in the room and not present inside himself, the moments that Priscilla needed something from him that he understood, even in the moment that he was not giving and that he watched himself fail to give, with the helpless clarity of a man who could see exactly what was happening and could not find his way to doing differently. He does not make excuses. That is what makes it devastating. He simply names what happened and acknowledges, without asking to be absolved of it, that it happened. The letter speaks of fear in terms that recontextualize everything that comes before it, not fear of death or failure or the public diminishment that every celebrity dreads. The fear that Elvis describes in these pages is more interior and more specific than any of that. It is the fear of having lived a life so thoroughly in service of something external, the career, the image, the machine, the expectations of everyone who needed him to be Elvis, that the private self, the one that wrote this letter and loved Priscilla in the way the letter describes, had been slowly crowded out, reduced, made smaller and quieter and less accessible, not by any single decision, but by the accumulated weight of 10,000 small surrenders to what the world required of him. And then there is the passage that Riley has reportedly been unable to read without breaking. Toward the end of the letter, Elvis writes about the future. He does not know, in the way that no one knows, what the future will actually contain, but he writes about it with the specific, aching tenderness of a man who is aware, on some level that does not require full conscious articulation, that he may not be in it for as long as the people who love him need him to be. He writes about what he hopes for them, the people who will come after, the children and the children's children, and whoever inherits the love he has carried through a life that did not always give him enough room to show it adequately. He writes, in those final lines, as if he knows he is writing to the future as much as to Priscilla, as if some part of him understands that this letter will travel further than the room it was written in, that it will find its way, eventually, to hands he cannot yet imagine, carrying a truth that the public record will never be able to hold on its own. Riley Keough's hands. Reading her grandfather's words, in a silence that contained everything. There is a particular kind of inheritance that has nothing to do with estates or royalties or the legal transfer of property from one generation to the next. It is the inheritance that arrives without paperwork, without a signing ceremony or a formal acknowledgement of what is being passed and to whom. It arrives in quiet moments, in the middle of ordinary tasks, in the specific and unrepeatable instant when you reach into the past of your own family and find something that reframes everything you thought you understood about where you came from. Riley Keough received that kind of inheritance the day she found that letter, and what she has been doing with it, what it means to carry it, to be the person through whom Elvis Presley's most private truth now travels forward into a future he could not have imagined, is the question that this entire story has been building toward. She was not supposed to be here. Not in the sense of fate or cosmic design, but in the practical, biographical sense that the role she now occupies was never something she sought or prepared for or imagined would fall to her in the specific way and at the specific moment that it did. Riley Keough built her own life with genuine intention, an acting career pursued on its own terms, an identity constructed carefully and independently of the gravitational pull that her grandfather's name exerts on everything it touches. She did not run from the name, but she did not use it as a foundation either. She built something of her own alongside it, and the discipline that required from someone in her position is not a small thing. And then the losses came, and then the responsibility came, and then the letter came, and now she is standing in a place that nobody else on earth occupies, the last living direct heir of Elvis Presley in her generation, holding a truth about him that the world has never had access to, making decisions every day about what that truth means and what, if anything, should be done with it. What Riley has said publicly about her grandfather is worth sitting with, because she does not speak about him in the flattened, reverential way that legacy management tends to produce, the careful, polished statements that honor the myth without engaging the man. She speaks about Elvis with the specific, complicated love of someone who has learned him through other people's grief, through her mother's stories, which were never simple, through Priscilla's testimony, which has always been honest in a way that the official record has not always welcomed, through the accumulated weight of growing up inside a family that loved a man who was gone before she arrived and who has been present in his absence in every room she has ever occupied. She has said that she feels him, not mystically, practically, in the music, which she grew up hearing not as cultural artifact, but as the voice of someone her family actually knew, in the photographs that line the walls of Graceland, which she does not experience as museum pieces, but as pictures of a person who was real and complicated and loved and flawed and gone too soon in a way that the people who survived him have never fully recovered from. In the specific quality of the grief that moves through her family like weather, unpredictable, unavoidable, the kind that you learn to live inside rather than hoping it will pass. And now, in a letter, in her grandfather's handwriting, in the private language of a man who found, in pen and paper, the version of himself that the rest of his life did not have enough room for. Priscilla Presley is still alive. She is in her late 70s, and she carries, with a grace and a dignity that the people around her have always found remarkable, the full weight of having been the woman that letter was written to. the woman who loved Elvis Presley through all of it, through the machine and the absences in the pharmaceutical management and the slow, heartbreaking erosion of a man who was too much for the world that had been built around him. She is still that woman. And the knowledge that Riley found that letter, that her granddaughter held those words in her hands and read them alone in the quiet of an afternoon that neither of them planned, opens a conversation between two people that the letter was always perhaps intended to make possible. What that conversation looks like is private. What it contains belongs to them. But the fact of it, the fact that a letter written by a dead man to the woman he loved has become a bridge between his granddaughter and the grandmother she is still learning to know, across the grief of everything the family has lost, is its own complete and moving truth. The letter did not stay in the past. It traveled. It arrived. It found the people it was meant for, in the time they needed it, carrying a version of Elvis Presley that the world has spent nearly 50 years trying to construct from the outside, and that he apparently managed, in a quiet moment with a pen in his hand, to simply write down. Riley Keough is 24 years into a life that has already contained more weight than most people encounter in a lifetime. She is building something for herself, for her family, for the legacy she did not choose but has chosen to honor honestly. She is doing it while grieving and while inheriting and while reading letters that break her open in the specific, necessary way that the truth breaks you open when you have been ready to receive it long enough. The letter exists. The truth in it exists. Elvis Presley wrote it to Priscilla, and Priscilla loved him, and their granddaughter found it in a drawer on an afternoon that had no particular reason to become the afternoon it became. In the specific quality of the grief that moves through her family like weather, unpredictable, unavoidable, the kind that you learn to live inside rather than hoping it will pass. And now, in a letter, in her grandfather's handwriting, in the private language of a man who found, in pen and paper, the version of himself that the rest of his life did not have enough room for. Priscilla Presley is still alive. She is in her late 70s, and she carries, with a grace and a dignity that the people around her have always found remarkable, the full weight of having been the woman that letter was written to. The woman who loved Elvis Presley through all of it, through the machine and the absences in the pharmaceutical management and the slow, heartbreaking erosion of a man who was too much for the world that had been built around him. She is still that woman. And the knowledge that Riley found that letter, that her granddaughter held those words in her hands and read them alone in the quiet of an afternoon that neither of them planned, opens a conversation between two people that the letter was always perhaps intended to make possible. What that conversation looks like is private. What it contains belongs to them. But the fact of it, the fact that a letter written by a dead man to the woman he loved has become a bridge between his granddaughter and the grandmother she is still learning to know, across the grief of everything the family has lost, is its own complete and moving truth. The letter did not stay in the past. It traveled. It arrived. It found the people it was meant for, in the time they needed it, carrying a version of Elvis Presley that the world has spent nearly 50 years trying to construct from the outside, and that he apparently managed, in a quiet moment with a pen in his hand, to simply write down. Riley Keough is 24 years into a life that has already contained more weight than most people encounter in a lifetime. She is building something for herself, for her family, for the legacy she did not choose but has chosen to honor honestly. She is doing it while grieving and while inheriting and while reading letters that break her open in the specific, necessary way that the truth breaks you open when you have been ready to receive it long enough. The letter exists. The truth in it exists. Elvis Presley wrote it to Priscilla, and Priscilla loved him, and their granddaughter found it in a drawer on an afternoon that had no particular reason to become the afternoon it became. And now, the weight of it belongs to the living, as it always eventually does. Some stories don't have clean endings. They just have people left behind, learning to carry what was left to them. If this one moved you the way it moved me, leave a comment and tell me what it brought up. Subscribe, because the stories that matter most are always the ones nobody finished telling.